Hi everyone, it's Jan from Jan Plans Things, and welcome to my Plan With Me video for this week. So I'm going to be doing a spread that's based on one of my Inktober pieces that I did last week. I think it was the prompt for bottle, and I had drawn a little grey cat, obviously based on my cat Humphrey, sitting inside a little bottle terrarium, and I really liked how he looked in that, and made me really happy to see you see his little cartoon when I finished that. So I thought I'd do something in a similar vein in my weekly, so that I kind of watch him throughout the week. So what you saw me do before just then was I laid down a bunch of water first, and then I kind of just splashed on a little bit of color to kind of tie together that area all at once. So by adding these little washes of color, you can kind of make it look like it's all under the same tone or lighting. Ideally, I think I would have put a bit more color down, but I didn't really notice until afterwards that it was a little bit pale, so I'd have to build up that color again. And I think the other thing was I was a little bit unsure about how much water to put on still, because I have been painting with watercolor paper all week and I was going back to notebook paper, so I was erring on the side of caution. But I did remember afterwards that the Archer and Olive is much better with dealing with water than the LT was. The only difference is though, is because the Archer and Olive paper is so bright and white, the white actually does come through the paint a bit more. So I actually did need to add a little bit more pigment to it in order to make the colors brighter. So after that, I'm going to slowly build up each of the colors using layers. And so I'm still using a mixture of my two sets of handmade watercolor paints at the moment. I'm using the Peppercorn dot card that I was given by Connie, and then also a set of the classic Argallo paints, along with a few of the dot cards that Alina from Argallo sent me as well. And I'm basically using that. What you can see what I'm doing now is I'm using the sap green off one of the landscape sets in the Argallo set. I'm just making a little cameo again, and I'm mixing that with a little bit of a yellow ochre, just to make it look like a goldish green leaf. The thing I was worried about here was that it's a little bit different painting in a notebook compared to painting on watercolor paper, because on watercolor paper you can really build up and layer up colors quite a bit, and have a little bit more intensity. But because of the way the notebook paper sits, it doesn't dry or bleed into each other as much. So the little lines and edges that you create with your paintbrush are a little bit more apparent with the notebook. So you do have to change your technique a little bit. I find that coated papers, like the papers in the LT, this happens a lot more. The Archer and Olive is a little bit more forgiving in that, but it does mean that you just have to be careful when you're layering up colors, that you're not getting hard edges where you don't want them. So I'm using the Ercolano red, which I think is very close to a Venetian or French red, and I'm just doing that as a base for the little mushrooms, because I'm still running mushrooms as my main theme. And then I'm just kind of like building up little colors. And for this plant that you see me planting now, I'm just doing a small wash of green and then just dabbing a little bit of that French red on the tops and just letting it kind of run. I think if I was doing it on watercolor paper, I would actually put a lot more water on and let it run, but because it's on notebook paper, I do paint a little drier, so that's just something that you should consider as well, especially if you're using a notebook that isn't as thick as the Archer and Olive, because the Archer and Olive is just a little bit more forgiving, especially if you want to paint techniques like that. So I'm just building up the colors as I go, and you kind of see everything looking a little bit paler. And for those of you who've been watching my videos for a while, you would have never really seen me paint this way in my Leuchtturm, because I don't feel like painting the Leuchtturm works as well this way, because you can't slowly build up colors as much because the paper is so thin. So you do change your painting style depending on the material that you're using. So it's just something to consider when you're planning out and what materials that you will be using for each notebook, and just, don't make it too hard on yourself if it doesn't look exactly the way it is, because the materials don't match completely. And I guess that's kind of like why I enjoy using this notebook so much, is that it is quite forgiving. Now, as you can see at this point here, the colors that I laid down at the beginning are starting to fade and look quite pale because I was kind of painting very quickly as I went along with this, so I hadn't left it enough for a long enough time to see the full effects of the initial wash. So I'm going to have to go back and build up that background a little bit more so that it doesn't look so empty at the top. I'm kind of just so when you're painting the leaves, if you paint them all in one monotonous color, it does end up looking very flat. So I tend to like to have variation in the paints when I do it. So sometimes I would paint a few darker leaves, and to do that I just dip it directly into the paint and don't dilute it onto my plate. And if I want a more thinner wash, then I'll do it on my plate. And what you can see me doing now is I'm just doing adding details using the thinner brush, and I'm using either a darker version of the paint that's in the center or a complementary similar color to do the outlines. And for those, if you do end up dipping the paint directly if you do end up dipping the paintbrush directly into the paint for this, it might end up too thick. So you do have to create a little splodge on the side and just water it down. This is mainly important when you're doing really thin lines, because that's when you're trying to get the little, you don't want it to dry and skip, and if the paintbrush is too dry then it will skip. So that's just something you can check. And sometimes if you're not used to it, I recommend having like a scrap piece of paper where you can test your strokes first before you start painting on your notebook and you're having to go over the line again, because I find that if you do have to go over the line twice, it'll probably look thicker because you're not able to like 100% paint in the exact same. I think in the past, you've seen me outline most of my bullet journal pieces using the black Pentel Pocket Brush pen or the Sakura Micron pen, but after experimenting with a couple of things in Inktober, I've been actually trying to outline everything using the complementary watercolor, mainly because I feel like it makes everything look a little bit softer. And so far I'm quite liking the effect, but I'll probably flip-flop in between days when I really want nice strong black lines and weeks like this week where I want everything a little bit softer. Some of you might have noticed that the back, so the cover that I'm using this week is different to the one I used last week. It's still the Hobonichi cover. I'm using the Soda, I think it's called the Soda water cover this time, and it's a zipper. I like zippers because you kind of just stuff everything in. This was part of one of the ones in my Hobonichi boxing earlier this year. You saw a little, sometimes I just go through and dab a little bit of a paper towel in there, and that's when I want to lift a little bit of paint on, because if I've made a mistake. If you've moved fast enough, you can lift the paint off. Some paints aren't as staining as others, so they do really react well to you lifting the paint off, so you can kind of like correct it. The other thing I've discovered a lot while I've been practicing watercolor is that if you end up putting quite a watery wash on top of a paint that you've already done, the water might actually push the paint off the paper as well, especially if it is a non-stain color and it does lift very well. So that's just something you might have to look out for as well, because you might end up getting that little edge of water along something that you want quite flat. So just keep an eye out for it, and you should always be trying to work from light to dark, and that would definitely help with that as well, because if you're adding a lot of light afterwards, you're either having to use white or water to push it down, and sometimes the water just lifts a little bit too much of it off. I'm using a lot of transparent cerulean here to do the background. This transparent cerulean I've picked up from Gallo. I just like it. It's a really nice soft color. She also has a really nice light blue on her Naturals palette, and I use that in my Mulan image, and that has a nice lot of granulation. I haven't really explored using a lot of granulating paints on my bullet journal yet, because I feel like I need to do a little bit more experimentation before I would use that up completely. What I'm doing now is I'm just filling in a few more details. So I felt like it looked a little bit empty, so I just kind of freehand drew a few leaves with the brush and just coloring them in now. And I'm kind of liking how it looks, except at the moment the plants next to the cat look like they're a little bit floating. So I'm just darkening that with a dark grey that I'm using mixed with the that I basically mixed using the brown ochre and the Payne's grey to create that. So the Payne's grey tends to be a bit blue, and by mixing a warm ochre with it, you can make it a little bit more neutral in terms of the tint. I'm using the Tombow pocket brush pen now to do the lettering, and like I mentioned last time, I finally worked out how to do it so that I can write vertically so you guys aren't disorientated when I turn the page and end up writing sideways. So that's basically this week. I'm finding Inktober's been actually a little bit hard because I haven't had as much time. This work's been really busy, but I'm still trying to fit in as much painting as I can, and I'm really enjoying it because I'm actually learning a lot. And thanks for following my journey, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys next time. Bye!